Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought provoking books. I'm Mark Kramer, a serial entrepreneur and who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Please allow me to introduce you to our guest today, Michele Zanini, co author of Humanocracy. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, you did. Hi, Mark, and hi, everyone.
Well, thank you for joining us today. And I have to tell you, it's an awesome book. I like Malcolm Gladwell types of books, and I like Adam Grant, and I think it's like at that level of book.
Thank you. I'm glad you think that.
It-
We try to make it a fun, entertaining read as well as a instructive one, a practical one. Yeah.
well, awesome. And again, thank you for being with us here today. So let me first start off by just you telling us a little bit about your background and the kind of consulting work that you do.
Sure. So I started my professional career in public policy research. I was a fellow at the RAND Corporation, which is a public policy think tank in California. And there, one of the first studies I worked on was around the researching patterns in terrorism. And it sounds very far afield from what we're going to talk about today, but in a way it isn't, because what we were seeing is how terrorist groups were, this is like in the mid 90s, they were starting to organize around loose networks and, without a lot of formal hierarchy. And they used to previously have like military-like structures, and they were doing something completely different. And this was enabled by technology, which allowed people to coordinate in kind of dispersed ways. And this was like the ultimate threat, right? Because the government and everybody countering terrorists was organized very much like bureaucratic hierarchies, and they were much slower to respond. And so this is before like the 9/11 attacks and all of that. But that's kind of what I was working on, and that just lit my light bulb in my head, and really reinforced the importance of organization as a way to kind of confer strategic advantage, right? So in a way, the way you're organized, the way you're managing the firm is a determinant of success. Yeah, your business model is important, but your business model in a way rests on top of a manager model, right? So I did that at Rand, and then I went over to McKinsey. I spent a decade working at McKinsey, always trying to do the kind of interesting, cool projects. And one of the projects was to work with Gary Hamel, who is the co-author of Humanocracy, and an idol of mine, since the 90s. And together, we really eventually ended up creating the management lab. I left McKinsey, and we've been working together for a decade. And our mission is to create organizations that are much more capable than most are today. And we think that the way to do that is to bust the bureaucratic management model that really is still powering most of these organizations, and create one that is based on a new set of principles, which I'm sure we'll get to later today. So that's in a way what we do. And as far as the kind of work we do, Gary and I do with companies, it's all about this. How do you dismantle bureaucratic management models, and how do you do that in a way that is very different from the traditional change process, which is very top down and kind of engineered. It's more one that is about involving everyone in experiment, in identifying solutions and experimenting with them.
I have to say, after reading your book, it reminded me of Startup Nation. Did you ever read that book?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and how the Israelis operate is very much like you say, and why their military has been so successful is because all the decisions were made at the point of contact, not all the way back. And I remember reading in that book that they said that wasn't that Egyptian soldiers weren't good or they weren't well trained, but since it was a command and control, everything had to go all the way up the line, so many levels. By the time the Egyptians responded to the Israelis had moved to the right or the left.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. And tell us about why you guys wrote this book.
Well, it's actually, you make a good point about sense and respond, right? And we wrote the book before the COVID crisis hit. We've been at it actually for over 5 years. And the crisis of COVID is proof positive that the future is less and less, the extrapolation of the past. And even before the pandemic, this was the case, right? If you look at the threats of job displacing automation, geopolitical conflicts, but also opportunities like robotics, Internet of Things, genomics, and so on, you just realize that we have an unprecedented array of challenges and opportunities, and what we need as a species is organizations that have unprecedented capabilities, right? And so we really set out the book to upgrade our institutional kind of capacity, right, to respond to and anticipate these challenges. And we think that as long as we don't change the way we are organizing and managing, we're not going to get there. We're not going to have truly capable organizations. So that's really what drove us. So there's almost like, on the one hand, a very kind of practical kind of motivation, which is like creating organizations that are more capable and therefore more successful, more profitable, and so on. There's also kind of a moral and ethical kind of orientation that really drove us to write the book, which is human beings are just not leading fulfilling work lives, and we're squandering a lot of human capacity. And that's just bad, not only for society and the economy, but also for individuals who work in these places who are, not able to flourish as much as they could. So those are, in a way, the two motivations. Mark.
Michele, a couple things struck me when I was reading this book. One is it's a must read for anyone, Fortune 1000, or anybody who's gotten a big slug of venture capital money. You absolutely have to read this book to avoid these pitfalls that these companies typically run into. The other part of the book that I thought was very essential is that my daughter is listening into this, and she handles the marketing for this and has a global marketing practice, and she's 30 years old, and her generation wants to be fulfilled. This idea of just going to work and earning a paycheck doesn't cut it with them. And if they can't feel that every day they're making some kind of contribution, that they're not intellectually stimulated, or this is no longer fun, or the organization doesn't listen to them, any of these things, especially now because of the internet, you can work with companies anywhere in the world. They're like, oh, forget it. I'm out of here. I'm just not going to deal with that. And so it's very important to read this book as a retention tool, recruiting and retention tool for companies. So I think that's very good. So let's start off with the first question is, how do you define bureaucracy?
Yeah, bureaucracy, it sounds like a quaint term, like, like horsepower, something of a bygone era, or sometimes it's applied narrowly to, like the DMV or government. But, we take the kind of the classic definition, which is one of an, kind of an organizational model that has the following characteristics. So, you have power that is vested in positions and titles. If there's an authority structure, there's a hierarchy, right, where power trickles down, where strategy and direction is set at the top, where resources are allocated at the top, where it's, leaders get appointed by, bigger leaders, right? Where it's really the task of managers to assign functions and roles and assess performance, where you have a lot of staff functions, HR, strategy, compliance, IT, finance, that set the rules, right, and enforce compliance, and where the competition and success among employees is for promotion, right? That's a scarce good. You want to move up the ladder, and that's how you get ahead, right? And where compensation is a direct correlate of rank, right? So like people with bigger titles have bigger paychecks, and so those are the kind of defining characteristics of bureaucracy. And we think it's I would be curious among your audience, like how many people, as I rattle off that list, how many people identify with those, kind of characteristics in their organization. And we think most especially large organizations operate that way. And it is an operating system that is pretty much universal. It applies to a government agency as much as it applies to GM and a Chinese prison, or it's just the way we think organization needs to happen at scale. And the only way we think that organization can happen at scale.
Well,
Yeah.
I also think that all of us and most of our audiences over the age of 50 have experienced what you've just mentioned here. But I think most of the audience is also entrepreneurs. Having those big bureaucracies is what allows entrepreneurs to succeed because they're like battleships in bathtubs, right?
Yep.
They can't, they're tripping over each other, and hence they miss all these great opportunities. You know, Zoom, the guy was a vice president at Cisco Systems, and he had this idea, and they turned him away because they had WebEx, and now he's worth not that much less than Cisco is right now. And he's personally worth like $15 billion. We had a company in Philadelphia called Shared Medical Systems. The guy worked for IBM. He had this idea with healthcare and they couldn't get out of their own way. So he just went off and started his own thing and grew it to $1 billion company. So you see this all the time. And you mentioned the book that there's only 11 companies left of the original Fortune 500. And we've seen companies come and go, and it's for the most part, it's the bureaucracy that sucks the life out of them, and they stop being creative, and their people just become robots, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the Cisco example is pretty remarkable, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. I think Cisco's worth 150 billion, and Zoom is worth 140 billion or something like that. And in a way, you could say that's the price of kind of strategic inertia, right? $140 billion for Cisco, right? And I think similarly with Microsoft, now they finally turned the corner and, have, with Satya Nadella have gone, and prioritized the cloud and de-emphasized Windows. And so they've, improved their market value and their, marketplace position in general. But even Bill Gates conceded that, they missed the mobile opportunity, and that's probably a $400 billion miss. And it's not because people at Microsoft didn't have those kinds of ideas or didn't even have really good prototypes of alternatives to the iPhone or other products. It's because, people at the top of the firm, had a particular paradigm of what success looks like, what the company needs to focus on, and they were able to squash any kind of new initiative, right? I mean, the bottleneck, funnily enough, is at the top of the bottle, right? and as long as people are unwilling to depreciate their intellectual, their worldview, that they have acquired over time, maybe when the industry was operating under completely different kind of realities, the organization is always going to be on the back foot because the organization cannot move faster than these people are willing to make it move, right?
Well, you look at Steve Ballmer. That was a lost 10 years of Microsoft's life.
Yeah.
I mean, they gained nothing during his time, and they lived off of it's like being Saudi Arabia, just living off your oil wells.
Yeah.
And that's all he's did. And when I taught 10 years at Wharton, when I would talk to my students who were at Microsoft, they said, it just sucks the life out of you, that there's no creativity. And then I would talk to my students who were working at Apple at the time that Jobs was there, and they go, oh my God, he's constantly encouraging innovation and ideas and wanting people to bring them up through the system as fast as possible. And so you see the two different sides of it, and it was soul crushing. And now the new CEO of Microsoft, what a huge difference. I mean, now people want to go to work for Microsoft again.
Yeah, but the tragedy of this is that you had to wait for a new CEO to make the shift, which is like a long overdue shift. And as you say, it took him 10 years to do that. So like and a lot of people say, well, all we need is a good CEO. We just need to find the right CEO and then we'll solve the problem. And the way we look at it, and if you look at the companies that we profile in the book, it's less about finding the right CEO, and it's more about creating an organization that isn't reliant on a CEO who's like super smart, super enlightened to succeed. Because if that's the premise, that all you need to nail who's at the top of the pyramid, you're going to be wrong more often than you're going to be right.
But don't you think the CEO makes the difference in the sense of, and even throughout your book, that those guys encouraged that good behavior that you wrote about? where other CEOs discouraged that. They might have played lip service to it, but they didn't get behind it. And you're the
Well,
CEOs that you talk about, and we're going to talk about those companies as we go along here. So let me ask you the next question. Don't big companies attract risk adverse people who like predictability and oftentimes run by finance people who love process and a command and control structure?
yeah, well, I mean, to give bureaucracy its due, it kind of works in the sense that it allows us to produce things efficiently at scale, right? So I think the new iPhone chip, what is it, the A14 for the, for the has like a 5 nanometer architecture, the space between transistors, and I think 5 nanometers is the length at which your fingernail grows in like 5 seconds. So to achieve that level of efficiency and control, it's just remarkable. And in a way, bureaucracy allows that to happen, and it allows reliability to happen. Now, as we argue in the book, you can still get that without all the baggage of bureaucracy. So there are ways to be efficient and innovative, right? But for most people, bureaucracy is kind of a trade-off. But in an environment where you're trying to predict and try to be reliable and to have a lot of discipline, yeah, of course, then the being quite reliable and quite risk averse is the name of the game. That's how you get ahead. Being innovative, taking risks is a career limiting and career risky kind of a move, right? So you end up having organizations that, yeah, maybe they are humming along and there are no big screw ups, but where, as you say, there isn't much innovation happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you find out with all large organizations is that once people start to make a really good salary and they're afraid to make any kind of mistakes, and public companies in particular, the CEO doesn't want to take any chances that money managers won't support whatever they're doing. And then if only time that they can take those chances is like GE now, which is dropped dramatically. Now this guy is expected to start taking those risks. You gave an example in your book of a health services company from the Netherlands that manages like an entrepreneurial company. Does the type of business dictate this?
You mean the business model or
Yeah.
yeah? Well, so let me just say a few things about Bertsorg, this home care company. So they have about 15,000 nurses and other home care workers working in small teams that are, as you say, very entrepreneurial. They're responsible for finding clients, for renting office space, for recruiting team members, managing budgets, and all of that. And there are no layers of management between these 15,000 people and the CEO and the founder. I mean, there are about 100 people at headquarters. Some are like regional coaches, and other are back office staff, primarily IT, because IT is kind of the backbone that connects all these teams together. They have an amazing system to do that. But it's pretty crazy, right? And by the way, they are incredibly efficient. They have the best customer, patient outcomes and so on. So that kind of blows your mind, like how you could have that kind of a large organization without all the armies of managers and administrators that you typically would see at that scale. So you're right that what makes it easy for Bertsorg to organize that way is that they have localized teams, each working in its own, area. And there isn't a lot of interdependence between these teams. So they can operate autonomously, perhaps more easily than in other firms. So if you have a model like that, a model where you have like a retailer, right? Or you have naturally decentralized operating units, this might be, easy to pull off in some regard. However, I would say that you might have read, Mark, in the book. I mean, there's an example of Morningstar, which is a tomato processor.
Yeah, I asked about that. Yeah.
Right. So their business model is one where it's it's a process firm.
Explain who they are.
So they're the largest tomato processor in North America. I think they process 30% of tomatoes. So everyone probably in this call has had tomatoes that were processed by Morningstar in their sauce or puree or whatever. And the guy who founded this firm, Chris Rufer, he's a kind of a libertarian and a big believer in personal freedom and personal agency. So he created a company that operates very much like that, where people are working together in different parts of the process, but they are they're no managers. They are all contracting with each other, and so they create these bilateral commitments with each other, and somehow from those kinds of commitments between colleagues, they generate this order, that emerges essentially from all these contracting that happens, and they are incredibly efficient and incredibly successful. No managers, and again, so kind of long answer to your question, Mark, but the business model will impact the way self-management might end up being interpreted, but the fact that you can do it in completely different industries, completely different geographies, I think shows you that it's not a particular answer to a particular kind of problem. It's more a universal kind of approach you can take.
And have any of these companies been able to do it cross-culturally? What I mean is that they're located in the US, but they run the same type of business in France and India and China, or is this very dependent on the culture of the region or country that you're in?
No, I think it's frankly universal. So each might have its own flavor that might be, flavor of the model that might be influenced by all kinds of factors, contingent factors. But let me give you an example. Handelsbanken is another company we talk about in the book. They're about 12,000 people. It's a bank headquartered in Scandinavia. They have about 750 branches, but they've expanded to the UK. There are about 200 branches in the UK. And the cool thing about Handelsbanken is that every branch, a little bit like these Bertsorg nursing teams, every branch is its own little startup. So it's about 10 people, and they have a control over to whom they extend credit, pricing, staffing, whether they take internal services like from IT and so on, and at what price. So they're basically engineered to be little startups, which is kind of crazy instead of a bank, because typically branches in, here, if you go to Bank of America, Wells Fargo, wherever, branches are essentially distribution centers, right? They don't really have any say into like the economics of the business. They have KPIs that they manage, like cross-sell ratios and whatever, but they're not real P&Ls. This bank has real P&Ls, and they opened up in the UK, and they grew like crazy, and they found all these people, all these bankers that wanted to be more entrepreneurial, couldn't be entrepreneurial in a traditional banking setting, and are just having amazing success. Now, you might say that the difference between Sweden and the UK isn't that great, but I'll tell you, this is true in other cases. Haier, which is a Chinese appliance maker, which we might get into later.
Yeah, we're going to.
They've acquired GE Appliances in the UK, in the US, based in Louisville, Kentucky, which is as far as you can get from Qingdao, China. And the CEO there, Kevin Nolan, has started to implement this kind of very entrepreneurial way of managing based on what Haier does, and they're having an enormous success. They're growing like faster than any other appliance maker in the US, and it's because it's a very universal idea. Like human beings, desire to be their own, to be self-directed, to make a difference, to stretch themselves, right? And so you can take that core concept and apply it anywhere, really.
So do you need specific skill sets for employees to operate in the self-managed model?
Can you say that again?
Do you need specific skill sets for employees to operate in the self-managed model?
Well, I think you do, but there's skills that are easily learned. So what you do in all these companies, self-management is enabled by the following things. First, you got to give people the decision rights, right? So you are able to make the following decisions. Second, you need to give them the information, right? So that they know whether their decisions are working, are having a good impact or bad impact, and they can adjust. Third, they need to have in a way, the business IQ or the business expertise to know what are good decisions, right? So, and third, and the last one, I would say, and then I'll give you an illustration, is that they need to have skin in the game. So they have to live with the consequences of the decisions they make. And let me give you an example from Nucor. They're like a large steel maker in the US, about 26,000 people. And they're the most profitable steel maker in the country. It's a blue collar workforce, and they're incredibly innovative. And so their teams, managing, for instance, the furnace, that takes the scrap metal and turns it into steel. They are able to negotiate with, providers of electricity, because that's electricity is really, what they need to melt, to apply the electric shock treatment to the scrap metal. So, people working the furnace are in contact with the electricity providers to set rates, to set time, how much power needed at what time, and so on. They decide, whether they need to replace equipment or not, whether to modernize it or not. They deal with the suppliers. They do all that themselves, so they're incredibly empowered. Second, they have the information. They know on an hourly basis, the profitability of their particular aspect of the process, right? Third, they know the economics of the business. Everybody at Nucor in every plant knows what return on assets is, what working capital means, what the cost of attrition is, what the cost of a loss, of downtime is. They have this really cool training. It's one of the things they do called dollars and tons. It's a day-long simulation where you're put in charge of a steel mill, and you compete with other people, and there are different teams working together, and they learn all these concepts through a simulation, and then they apply them. And lastly, around incentives, so they get compensated on how much steel gets pushed out every day. And so beyond a particular rated capacity, let's say it's like 80, whatever they produce on top of that, they make a big chunk of that additional productivity gain. And so they are constantly searching for new ways of innovating and try new things, because the more they produce, the more they sweat the assets, the more money they make, right? So if you do all those four things, you don't need to control people. They'll do what's right, not only by them, but by the company, right? Because the interests are completely aligned. It's not like you have the managers and the employees. Everybody in a way is both, like both a manager and an employee.
So talk about a little bit about this, because I don't think they're unionized, correct?
They're not.
And they get paid less than unionized employees on an hourly basis, but they actually make more, and their jobs are secure. So explain how that's worked to their benefit.
So at Nucor, so the compensation system I kind of alluded to earlier works as like this. Their base salary is lower than the typical one in the industry, but they have a much higher upside. As I said, if they have a weekly productivity bonus, so which depends on how many tons of steel they push out safely. Like you get docked if you have like safety issues that take place in the plant when in that particular week. But which means that the more they produce, the more they churn out, the more money they make. And in a typical year, they make a 25-30% more than their peers. And the interesting thing is this. U.S. Steel, which has a unionized workforce, they also have a profit sharing plan. But the profit sharing at U.S. Steel is based on the price of steel, which is completely exogenous. Like these people can't do anything about the price of steel.
Right.
At Nucor, it's based on how much they produce, and they have entirely. I mean, yes, of course, sometimes they can produce less because the cycle is against them, but in general, it's something that they can actually influence themselves. So it's a completely different way to think about rewards and upside, right? In one case, you have nothing to do with it, so who cares? Nothing you can do every day affects your profit sharing plan. In the other case, it's entirely driven by what you can do. So that's one thing around compensation. Around job security, at Nucor, there's a saying, do your job well, have it tomorrow, which means, they fire people that are incompetent, and it's typically the team that fires incompetent people, not a manager, because again, it's a team bonus, right? So if you're the furnace crew, and you have someone who's holding you back, you want to get rid of that person, right? You don't need to complain to HR. You just, so they fire people that are not good fits, but in general, there are no layoffs. They've never laid anybody off. In fact, they're the only ones, I think, in the industry that have done that. They've grown employment while everybody else has shrunk employment. And this creates an enormous amount of security and trust right? And so you're going to, with that kind of social contract in place, you're going to give your best. And in fact, the irony, Mark, and I'll just stop here so you can ask other questions, but they are the world leader in steel, in the steel industry, in automation. And you know why? Because people know that, hey, first of all, your compensation depends on getting the most out of your capital. So of course you want to automate things that you are doing manually, so you can do something more productive, right? Like, why would you want to spend time doing BS work if you're getting compensated on productivity? The second thing is that you're not going to lose your job. So like, while at other steel makers, other manufacturing companies, workers may stay completely mum about things that they could outsource to a machine because they feel like, if I say that, I'll lose my job. At Nucor, it's the opposite, right? You want to offload all the crap work to a machine so you can do more things with your time, more productive things. There's a completely different kind of attitude towards these things.
Yeah, I was very impressed with what they were able to do there, but the employees are totally aligned as stakeholders. And I guess, is Nucor public? I couldn't remember.
They're a public company, yeah.
Yeah, so everything that they do is totally aligned with the investors themselves, for themselves, and they feel that they have some control over their future because they're in charge of their future at the lowest level of the organization. So if it doesn't work, they have nobody to blame but themselves. And if it succeeds, they share in the riches that come from the success.
Yeah, and as you say, Mark, the investors get it. I just find it sometimes quite a dubious claim to say that somehow the investors are, making it difficult for companies to innovate or to treat their employees better and so on because they're so thirsty for that quarterly dividend. I actually think it's the other way around. Like, if you can tell a good story to an investor, say, look, the way we generate money is by leveraging this collective genius across the enterprise, which is why we need to empower these people, which is why we can't fire them if there's a downturn, because you know what? They'll invent new things when they're idle. And by the time the cycle goes back up, we'll be even more successful. If you tell that story, investors will understand. If you have no story to tell and you say, our people are essentially commodities and our business success isn't dependent on exactly who we have, because they're quite replaceable. Yeah, then of course the investor might say, well, then let's get rid of them, right? Because you can replace them. So it's, in a way, I think it's completely backwards. Like, the investors get it. If you put people at the human beings at the center of your business model, then investors will be much more understanding.
I think entrepreneurs totally get that concept, because every entrepreneurial venture I ran, when I read the story, I said, that's exactly how I ran all the companies I had, which was to empower the people. Everybody benefits financially from it. And every time you read the story in Inc. magazine and an entrepreneur talks about it, they talk about exactly this process that they go through, because they've left the large company because they weren't getting that kind of ability to control their futures and participate in the profit of the success and of their own ideas. And before I ask you some other questions, talk about Hire as well, because I bought their product 15 years ago, actually 18 years ago, and they were much less than Kenmore and some of the others. And it turned out to be a great product that they were developing. And they have a process for even developing products that encourage it. And it goes along with the lines of, how do you elicit the everyday genius? So talk about that.
Yeah.
And explain who these guys are.
Yeah, so they're the largest appliance maker in the world. They have about 80,000 people worldwide, 60,000 in China. But as I said, they have about 15,000 people in the US with GE appliances that they bought in 2016. And they've been on a tear for the last couple of decades. They've grown faster, both profits and revenues, than any other competitor, both in China and elsewhere. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the CEO, who's been there for a long time, is really committed to turning the entire company into like a network, and where you have entrepreneurs internally and externally who are plugging into this network. And so, because it doesn't do you much good if you just decentralize and you have all this chaos. So the trick is to decentralize and create entrepreneurial energy, but then leverage the scale of a large firm, right? And I think Hire has been really successful at that. So they've, let me give you like the picture from China, and so the main part of their business. So they've disaggregated the company into 4,000 micro enterprises, as they call them. And these are little units of about 10 people. And some of them are like, the product management unit, so a new appliance, like a 3-door refrigerator or something like that. And they're the ones responsible for, bringing that to the consumer. But then this micro enterprise contracts with other micro enterprises for services. So you have manufacturing, you have design, you have distribution, right? You have marketing. And so they, a little bit like Morningstar, I mentioned earlier, but like a larger scale between, different units, they have internal contracting. And then all these, micro enterprises, basically are compensated on the success of the product that they bring to market. So even if you're manufacturing and you do your job and you produce with the refrigerator that they ask you to produce, if that refrigerator does badly in the market, you get docked. Your compensation get docked. So like everybody is working for the customer, right? And which is what the Jean Grumin, the CEO, said. No, we don't need managers because everybody reports to the customer. Even people deep in the bowels of like finance and R&D, they get compensated on how well the products that they bring to life do. And the other cool thing, Mark, you alluded to about Hire, is that they develop their products very much in the open. So they always start by, crowdsourcing like needs and desires of the customer. So, for instance, let's say you want to understand, what features should our new air conditioner have. They just have these, they use, social media, tap into social media sites in China, which are really big. They get millions of people engaged on what are the biggest pain points, what else would you need, and so on. And then once they develop all of that and synthesize it, they put together a prototype. The prototype goes up on a crowdfunding platform. And if they have enough people that buy the prototype, then that goes into production. So like basically no product is put out to the market unless it's been thoroughly kind of crowdsourced, both in terms of like the pain points and the user needs, but then also the actual working prototype. So it's a pretty remarkable way, right, of thinking about how products are developed. Very, very much, customer driven and led.
But I think the founder of this company is entrepreneurial, and he basically looked and said to himself, I wouldn't want to work for a bureaucracy. I wouldn't want to just come to work like a robot. And if I could just encourage everybody to be thinking about their line of business and they're all getting a chance to make a difference, come up with their own creative ideas, and take pride in it, then he's essentially a venture capitalist with 4,000 investments.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool thing is that they also have investments from outside. So if you want to start up something, a new, for instance, there's this micro enterprise that focused on creating IoT, so Internet of Things enabled washing machines in college dorms, right? So, and the idea was you have an app that allows you to schedule your wash, but then this app has other services you can buy. You can buy like snacks or like shelving or whatever. So they created this little ecosystem of products within this app. So it was a Hire washing machine, but that they installed. So Hire made money out of that. But then it was really the app that drove this. And so Hire, so the guy that came up with this idea was an internal Hire employee, but he got external venture capital. He put his own money, and he got his own equity stake. And then he obviously had Hire as a I don't even know if Hire was a majority shareholder or not. But basically, so that's a Hire micro enterprise. And I think that, and there are a few other like that, and ended up, some of them get reacquired by Hire. So there's like some sort of earn-out mechanism. So Hire can kind of buy back the equity that it has given others. But in some cases, they go public. They do a little IPO. And I think this might have gone public earlier this year. And so like the employee becomes a millionaire. So it's basically, go back to the example, Mark, of Eric Yuan at Zoom. So if Cisco had been operating like Hire, Eric Yuan would have been told, all right, you want to start something like an alternative to WebEx? Fine. Here's, you started, we maybe participate with some equity, and then let's see what happens. And he would have gone off, instead of leaving Cisco, he would have created within Cisco, right? At Hire, that happens all the time, which is a pretty remarkable thing, especially if you think about the fact that it's an appliance maker. It's not like Silicon Valley darling or anything like that.
Yeah, but I also, right. It's not some like tech, although technology is a huge part of what
Yeah.
they do. It's just in that particular space. The other thing I thought that they did, and I think we've all experienced if you've worked for a large company, is let's say you want printing done. They say, oh, we have a printing shop, and then the printing shop charges you money. Hire basically says, talk to our printing shop. If they can't give you the best price, then don't pay them. Go to somebody else. Whatever you need, go within the Hire system. If somebody can't do better than the outside, then and then that requires Hire to get smarter about whatever they're doing so they can match or better the price.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
he does is it's very, very, very smart.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, the irony, of course, is that Hire in a way is like the best example of quasi unfettered like internal capitalism within a firm, and
Right.
it happens in communist China, while in the U.S. most of those decisions are very much made like the Soviet Union, right? Capital allocation and all of that. It's all like it's like the Soviet Politburo deciding like where to spend money, and there are all these internal monopolies. There's only one HR department, one IT department, and if you don't like what they do, well, screw you. You have you can't go anywhere else. You just have to use them, right? So
Yeah.
it's very interesting in that way.
How, as you write, stop organizations from beating the bold out of you? Because you talk about being bold, and how do you stop these organizations from beating it out of the people that they're hiring, especially if you want to get smart people like you work for McKinsey. If you're trying to hire McKinsey type thinkers, if they're not going to want to come to an organization that they can't be bold. And when you get the smart kids coming out of college, no matter what school that they're coming from, they also want to be challenged. I had one of my students just yesterday call me. He had went to St. Joe's, and he said this organization he's in, they're not allowing him to grow. So I want to leave.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, Mark. So you got to allow everyone to be able to experiment, right? You can't just leave it to the big wigs in R&D or product development or whatever. Like everybody should be able to try something out, something new. Like Amazon is a pretty good example, right? They're a large company, but anybody can really start an experiment, and no one can really stop an experiment. In the book, we have this example of Greg Linden, who is the guy behind the shopping cart idea, right? And he basically got this idea. He was like going to the checkout of the supermarket, and he saw that there are all these like things you can buy as you wait in line, right? The chewing gum and the magazines and whatever. He said. And he thought, well, this was like in 2000, I think. So very early on in Amazon's history, when it was just primarily selling books. And he said, well, why don't we implement something like that in our in when people check out? So as you go and check out, before you pay, you're saying, would you be interested in this product or that product or whatever? And his boss said, no, that's like, we don't want to do that, because if we do, maybe the customer will abandon the checkout process, and it's a distraction, it adds friction. And so he was very much against it. And Greg said, well, screw what he says. I want to try this anyway. So, and he tried it in a little part, not with every customer, but, what he found is that, it was actually customers loved it. Right. And then he said, that's really the kind of culture you want. And it even ended up being awarded like the Just Do It, award at Amazon, and Jeff Bezos gave him used Nike sneaker, to exemplify that. So you have to create an environment where everyone has the authority to try something. Eric Yuan should be able to try the alternative to Zoom, as long as it's not very expensive, or it's not a huge distraction, and it's within certain parameters, which you can totally do. You can run an experiment without investing a ton of capital. You have to also give the people the tools and expertise, right, to run a proper experiment, to do this right. Just saying, go ahead and try something without giving them the means to do that in an intelligent way is a recipe for disaster. And as I said, the third thing, you want to give people the incentives, right? So they are doing the right thing, and they have the motivation. I'm not sure if this is true in the case of Greg Linden and Amazon. I don't think he started his own little checkout business within Amazon, but at Hire, that's very much what happens, right? So you start your firm, you start your micro enterprise, And if it goes well, you generate, a huge amount of upside. So those
Yeah,
would be the three things.
yeah, I definitely think that's a super smart way of going. Can you please talk about why you use the Atlas project and explain what that is as an example of a successful organization not running top down?
Yeah. So the Atlas project is a very interesting example, and we showed it we had it in the book to show like the fact that you can manage without managers, even at an amazing degree of complexity, right? Because that's always the pushback. Like, oh, you can manage without managers if you're like 5 people startup or whatever, but if it's like a large organizations, absolutely you need this managerial kind of overhead to make sure things don't fall apart. And so Atlas is basically a research initiative that one of the four that makes up the Large Hadron Collider, and which is based in Geneva. And Atlas was launched in the 90s. It's basically has more than 3,000 scientists, all encompassing 880 different research institutions. And they were launched to uncover the deepest secrets of the universe, right? So they wanted to find the God particle, the Higgs boson, which they got a good trace of a few years ago. And so to detect those kinds of particle, they built one of the most sophisticated machines ever constructed. So it's a huge particle detector that is about 45 meters high and 25 meters long, and it's got 10 million parts, and it has to be like they had to design all of this and then put it deep beneath the soil. Like it's all underground. And it's something that has an enormous amount of interdependency, because one piece affects the other piece, and it needs all to be right. And there's also this uncertainty as they develop this technology, because it's never been done before. So problems would always come up. Oh, the people that designed one magnet, figured out that it needed to be bigger than what they originally thought. Well, that means that there's less space for these other parts. And so they had to figure out, like, how do we coordinate? And so the way they did that is not through some sort of management chain, but rather they call it adhocracy. Basically these task forces that whenever there was an issue of that kind would just basically emerge, and they would try to figure out, horizontally coordinating peer to peer, how to solve that problem. And they did that every time there was the coordination challenge. And, not only did they deliver this product in this amazing feat of engineering on time, but they did it also within budget. And as I said, it's just a very good example of how, like, even when it comes to extremely complex problems, you can find ways to coordinate and get the control you need without that sort of like traditional approach, which is very much management driven.
So when you write a major car companies didn't see Tesla coming, could it be the board felt they had such a big investment in traditional car manufacturing, they wanted to wait for someone to grow the new market first? Because I always think that they never want to be on the leading edge. Nobody in the organization wants to necessarily take those risks. And the finance people look and say, oh my gosh, we have all these plants. Retooling these plants will cost us X amount of dollars. I mean, American car companies learned a very hard lesson from the Japanese when they weren't creating the best quality car. And the Japanese were not only creating better quality cars, but cooler cars. And it made us have to ratchet up our game, even though we were kind of the creators of the car industry.
Yeah. So I think in September, GM announced that they were going to invest in their own EV technology, fully invest in their own proprietary one, as opposed to just sourcing it from others. And I think Tesla, when was the first Tesla out? Like in 2010, 2011,
Something like that. Yeah.
So GM, it took GM 10 years to make this investment. I suppose better late than never, but the fact that it took them 10 years to get to this point is pretty remarkable. And it's not just GM, the German car manufacturers the same way, even Toyota and so on. So like, I don't know, like how long does it have to take that long? I mean, I can understand the hesitancy at the beginning, but how much evidence do you need? I mean, let me give you another example, maybe even more damning. I think, right at the same time, I think GM announced that it wanted to invest in battery technology and so on. Walmart said, we're going to introduce Walmart Plus, which is our alternative to Amazon Prime, right? So you pay $90 a year or something like that, and you
Yeah.
get, yeah. And I just looked, for kicks, I said, when did Amazon do that? Do you want to venture a guess when Amazon introduced Amazon Prime?
Well, Amazon Prime, I think, has been around with like maybe 8 or 10 years, and Walmart's just been in the past 3 years, right?
So Walmart introduced Walmart Plus this September. Amazon Prime was introduced by Amazon in 2005, 15 years ago. All right. And so, and they've invested, they bought jet.com. They had their own, Walmart lab in Silicon Valley, figuring out the future of the internet and all of that. Yet it took them 15 years to copy Amazon on Amazon Prime. I mean, how in what planet is that like? Is that normal? Like, why did it take them 15 years, not 15 months, 15 years to do this? It's just I don't know. So the notion that somehow, I mean, I don't buy fully the whole like disruptive innovation thing where somehow you don't want to cannibalize your existing business and therefore you're slow to respond. I mean, it might make sense to some extent, but in the case of Amazon and Walmart, and think about like what costs would Walmart have had to incur to make this happen earlier? What cost would they have had to incur to respond to Amazon more properly on e-commerce? They're just now getting their stuff together. It's just the fact that I just anyway. So it's just another example, and I'm just not convinced that somehow this is inevitable, right?
I think on too many layers. I think you have an idea and you see that ideas aren't necessarily encouraged, or if people have had ideas, they've been shot down early. And to get you, like you say, there's like 15 layers of management in some of these companies. They don't run like flat organizations. One of the things you wrote about is and I want to know is what's wrong with the concept of thinkers are at the top and doers at the bottom because the thinkers get the big bucks. What's the problem with that?
Well,
talk about it.
Because, if you have like 10 people at the top who are responsible for seeing and sensing and responding to all the stimuli, all the challenges we talked about earlier, it just like sees anybody's cognitive capacity. You're not going to have that many smart people up there, right? That can make all those decisions. And a lot of the information is at the periphery, it's distributed. So like, it's just like an elitist and frankly wrong perspective that somehow those people at the top know more than everybody else. It just doesn't work that way, especially in a large company, especially in this kind of environment that changes so quickly. A lot of knowledge is distributed, and the people at the top are the last people that find out. I mean, so let me give you, Mark, a quick statistic. So this is from an HBR study that the former dean Nitin Noria ran with Michael Porter. It came out a couple of years ago, and they looked at the diary of CEOs in large firms in the U.S. I think mostly U.S., or maybe there were some international ones. And they said, how much time are CEOs spending with customers? You want to venture a guess in a year?
Like 1%.
Yeah, it's like 3%.
Yeah.
3% is with the customer, and they spend more time with McKinsey and so like with consultants than they do, like 4 times as much. And so in what world where that happens are the CEOs going to know more?
Impossible.
Right. So it's just, to me, it's insane. But in a way, bureaucracy creates that kind of a caste system, right? Where the thinkers at the top, the doers that are at the bottom, and the people that see the future at the top, and everybody else is heads down. That's just like unrealistic, and it's a huge waste of intellectual capacity, right?
I once actually worked for a guy where I was the number 2, and we were taking this space and creating kind of like an incubator. And so one of the maintenance guys with an 8th grade education had this idea, and the CEO said to me, he's a maintenance guy. What the hell would he know? Why would you even listen to him?
Easy.
So this guy went on vacation, and I empowered the guy to do this. We ended up making $150,000 off of his idea, and it only cost us $5,000 to implement it. And he couldn't believe it. but this guy knew way more about restructuring space than I would ever know. And so I just said, what's the harm in us trying to go and do this? One of the things I thought was interesting, you wrote in your book, why do, as you write in the book, bullying managers who learn to listen open-heartedly again revert back to being bullies? And how do leaders discourage that?
Yeah, so I think that was in reference to a movement to called sensitivity training in the 60s, where people were like in the 60s, the height of like new ageism and so on. But there are a lot of people that really understood that authoritarian management was a bad thing to do. And so they would, companies would send their managers to training for a week or two, kind of unthinkable today. And they, during the sensitivity training, they would learn, how their behavior was just like so toxic. And they would almost have like this, awakening, moral and spiritual awakening. So they would go back to work and say, this time it will be different. I'm going to be a new leader, I'm going to be a better leader. I'm going to empower my team, blah, blah, blah. And so they would start that way, but like everybody around them, operated in like the similar way as they did before this training. So by the end, after 6 to 12 months, like, screw this, like, I have to play the game everybody else plays. So that was in reference to that, which means that you do need to pair like individual shifts in mindset with institutional change in kind of how the organization is managed. Like one can't work without the other. But the importance of mindset is very, very, very large. You do need to start with yourself as a manager. You need to challenge yourself. How am I? Because bureaucracy, if you pardon my French, makes assholes of us all, right? And so, like, how do I de-asshole-ify myself? How do I keep myself honest? Because there are all these behaviors. I'm padding a budget. I'm undermining a colleague. I'm doing things that out of lazy, because I don't have confidence in my team that I could actually give out to them, but I just want to do it myself, or I'm taking credit for someone else's decision, or whatever it is. Like, keep yourself honest. Do a check. We have a little checklist, little exercise in the book, and then maybe ask your team to keep you honest. So it starts there, but as I said, it doesn't end there. Right? You also then need to change mindsets and then the broader kind of management context in which you operate.
Your opinion is that technology hasn't reduced bureaucracy or encouraged creativity. Why?
Well, it could. And in fact, a lot of the companies that we feature in the book use technology to enable the lateral coordination that needs to happen if you don't have managers doing the coordination. So like Bertzorg, I mentioned earlier, they have this amazing system that allows the nursing teams to coordinate with each other. But often technology can be used to control people, right? And there are these people are saying that it's ushering a new wave of Taylorism. They call it digital Taylorism, where you can control everybody's keystroke or what they do. And so technology can be a force for empowerment, or it can be a force for micromanagement. And so we shouldn't be thinking that by itself it's going to dislodge bureaucracy. It could actually make it even more efficient, and it gives us the opportunity, but we need to really change our paradigm for it to be fully effective in liberating people at work.
Here's my last question for you, and I thank you so much for being on with us today. For entrepreneurs trying not to fall into the bureaucracy trap, what do you recommend when building their business? So from the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you the story. It's not in the book, but I'm doing active research with these guys. They're called Vicusville. They're a large, now large. They started really small 10 years ago. Grocery chain in Russia, around Moscow. The guy who founded, and they're doing an IPO next year. They're like one of the unicorns of Russia. Their sales are over $1.3 billion US. So they've become quite a significant company. The guy who founded it read Gary Hamel's, my colleague's, article about Morningstar, the company we talked about earlier, and said, I want to create a company that is like that. I want to create a company that doesn't have managers, or has very few managers, and where everybody can be self-managing. So he created this company, and where very much, like we described at Nucor and so on, different stores are essentially local little business units, and where people in the store participated in the performance of the store. So a quarter of the compensation of store people is dependent on store sales. So, and they, like Nucor, lower base salary, but much of an upside, where you can start your own business very much like Hire. And where, interestingly enough, you have incredibly low, or incredibly high rather, ratios of, span of control. So they have like 12,000, 10,000 people working there. They have, like, again, 2 layers of management. And the interesting thing for support services, so for instance, legal or HR, IT, whatever, what they do is that they divide. So take legal. So as they grow, so legal, you start hiring lawyers. What they do is that they divide the legal department into little legal departments, and then you can choose the legal department you want to work with. And so they said, instead of adding layers of management under legal, we just keep legal departments really small, entrepreneurial. We just have more of them. And there's like almost like internal competition. And if you're and you get paid on activity. So if you're a legal department that is, uncompetitive, you don't offer good advice, or you're too pricey, you lose business, and then you go out of business. No one needs to fire you. Because no one will come to you. And so they've created this logic as they grew, right, of like keeping things really disaggregated. Having, again, there a lot of customer feedback and input in determining, in basically regulating performance. So everybody like high reports to the customer. Keep disaggregating big units into small units, and then giving people the upside so that they'll make the right decision, not only for themselves but the company. So I'll be writing about them. Hopefully there'll be an article about them.
And the name of the company again?
It's VKUSVILL, means Tasty Town in Russian. They make like organic and locally sourced food. And I'll be writing about them. So I'll share with you, Mark, so you can share with your audience the article, because there's almost nothing written about them. They reached out to us. They said, hey, we're doing what you guys said we ought to do. And the cool thing is that when they go out to, as I said, they're going to go public next year. The cool thing is that they go out to the investors and say, we have what's really driving our success is not the business model, but they have they call it Beyond Taylor. Taylorism, Frederick Taylor, the scientific management, inventor. He said, our management model is the most important asset, and that they use that in their investor perspectives, which is pretty remarkable. So anyway.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us information about your book. I hope everybody buys this book, because to me, it's like a must-read book, especially for entrepreneurs who are looking to build a great company, and for people who feel stymied in their existing company, or think, I should just break out and do my own thing here rather than do this. So I wish you the best of luck with this book. And when you do your next book, please let us know.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great and safe weekend. Everybody have a wonderful, safe weekend. Take care.
Bye-bye.